Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for SAFE's Ambassador Alfred Hoffman Jr. Center for Critical Mineral Strategies inaugural briefing event. My name is Abigail Wolf, and I am the Director of SAFE's Center for Critical Mineral Strategy. SAFE is a mission-driven, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing transformative transportation and mobility technologies and ensuring the United States secures key aspects of the technology supply chain to achieve and maintain its strategic advantage. SAFE Center for Critical Mineral Strategy aims to develop policies that make sure we have access to secure, responsible supplies of minerals necessary to achieve those goals from mine to market. While previous events from other groups have focused on the importance of minerals for the electric future more broadly, our event today hopes to examine why it is important for us to capture all or some of the critical mineral supply chain, both here and among our allies. The world is transitioning to an increasingly electric, connected, and autonomous future powered by batteries and built using critical minerals. The transportation sector, in particular, is undergoing a massive transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, shifting our dependence from oil to critical minerals. This transition will have wide-ranging consequences for U.S. supply chains and the geopolitical relationships upon which we rely for the minerals and metals necessary to compete. In 2020, the United States imported more than half its non-fuel mineral resources and was 100% import reliant for 13 of the 35 minerals deemed critical by the U.S. Department of the Interior. And while the U.S. imports minerals from more than 100 different countries, the supply chain for electric vehicles and batteries in particular is concentrated in just a few key regions and dominated by China. As minerals take a larger role in our economy, do we risk offshoring US-based manufacturing without reshoring or nearshoring all or parts of the mineral supply chain? How can Americans and our allies be better equipped to fully compete in the transportation, energy, defense, and technology industries of the future? To help examine these questions, we will hear from speakers from the defense, auto, and clean energy sectors, all of which rely upon mineral supply chains to determine what it means for their success if the United States and our allies remain reliant upon other nations for all or parts of the mineral supply chain. We will also hear from an expert on the upstream side of critical minerals to help frame our expectations of what is actually geologically possible to ensure mineral supply meets the growing demand. I will now introduce all of our speakers in the order in which they will appear, and then I will rejoin you back on screen after all of them have spoken for a moderated question and answer session with the speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Nina French, Technical Director of Advanced Energy and Materials for the Defense Innovation Unit. Dr. French will discuss the defense industry and technology's reliance upon mineral supply chains. She will be followed by Robert Schilp, Global Director for Electrified Powertrain Purchasing at Ford Motor Company, to provide an automotive perspective. Carl Oberland, Vice President of Procurement for Siemens, will follow to discuss how the clean energy sector is responding to mineral supply chains. And finally, our final speaker will be Dr. Murray Hitzman, SFI Professor of Economic Geology at the University of College Dublin, Director of the Irish Centre for Applied Geosciences, and former Associate Director for the U.S. Geological Survey's Energy and Minerals Mission Area. With that, thank you again to everyone for joining us here today. Please remember to post any questions for the speakers in the chat box, and please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Nina French.
Thank you, Abby. So I have like the best job in the world. It took me 40 years to train for this job. I came from Department of Energy, did 3 startup companies, and now I'm with the Defense Innovation Unit. So I just want to give you a brief overview of why this is relevant to what you're thinking about, because the Defense Innovation Unit was set up by Ash Carter 5.5 years ago. And the idea was to tap into commercial technologies and bring them into Department of Defense. And so we are situated in Silicon Valley. We have an office in Austin, Texas, and in Cambridge, and of course in the Pentagon. So we're directly under the Office of Secretary of Defense. We are self-funded And the thinking that Ash Carter had 5.5 years ago, or 6 years ago, as he set this up, was the private sector spends about 10 times more money than DoD does. But also, they expedite technologies. So his thought was, why don't we find a way to bring these technologies into DoD? So we are one of 6 portfolios. We have an autonomy portfolio, which is drones, artificial intelligence, machine learning, space, cybersecurity, and human resources, which is everything on the warfighter. So we are the 6th portfolio. We just stood up in January of this year, advanced energy and materials. But the whole DIU concept is that we broker deals between commercial technologies and Department of Defense. We are not a funding organization. We always have a transition partner, but we can bring technologies into Department of Defense, and we have very rapid contracting authority. We can go from solicitation to a contract in 60 to 90 days. We've done about $700 million in deals so far. In advanced energy, and kind of what pertains to this, probably our highest focus right now is energy storage. And that's why this conversation with Abby has happened, because when we look at energy storage, we look at supply chain, our goal, of course, is national security. And we are so dependent on China for supplying the materials we need to manufacture and put cells into batteries. There is a huge effort right now within DoD to electrify vehicles. We're starting small, kind of what I call a small bite of the apple. We're looking at stop idle, which is at a forward operating base, vehicles go out and then they sit for 10, 12 hours, and we call it a hotel load, where the soldiers need to be warm or cold. They need to have their equipment on, and they just idle a IC engine. And so we are looking at and starting a prototype of electrifying those vehicles. And so we'll have a battery pack so they can turn the IC engine off and run on batteries so there's no heat signature and there's less fuel consumption, which is a big issue. That is all based on conventional DoD battery technology, but we're also starting a very big project with the Army and the Navy and the Air Force to look at next generation batteries. So how can we move away from the one battery that they like, lithium ion, and see where we want to be in 5 to 10 years? And I think that the other important part of this is sourcing, and I'm sure you know this, and I think Abby spoke very well about it, is that we cannot, from a national security point of view, we cannot be dependent on the processing and the cell manufacturing that takes place in China. And in my opinion, that happens because they have cheaper labor and they have less environmental regulations. And those are the 2 factors that we need to think about as a country. And I think that I have been talking to Idaho National Labs, to Oak Ridge National Labs, people who have expertise in the byproducts of this processing. And that Nevada, for example, is another state that does this well. So we need to tap into what Department of Energy has already done with processing this material so that we're mining it here and we're shipping over to China to process it. And that is just it's not sustainable. And if there's ever a conflict, it's going to put the United States at a huge disadvantage. So I think that we are looking at this. We have Title III, which is a congressional mandate to put manufacturing back in the US. And I'm a real advocate of saying we need to process our own rare earths and we need to make our own cell manufacturing. And then we have the question of allies. You know, can we rely on Australia, for example? But can we rely on them if they're not funded by China? And I think that's a political question. I think allies are going to be really critical in this particular mission, but I think that we have to make sure that we don't have Chinese money or Russian money behind it. And I will wrap it up with that.
Thanks, Nina. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Schilp, and I am the Global Commodity Director for Electrified Powertrain with Ford Motor Company. And I'd like to take the opportunity to hit on a few of the Ford realities. And I want to thank Abby and Safe for giving me the opportunity to share. Let me begin with a few of the basics around battery cells and materials in terms of the basics of what we do in terms of the battery cells. But before I do, I want to highlight a couple items here about Ford and our approach with battery electric. So just as high-level background, Ford, starting with Bill Ford, the board of directors, clearly remain fully committed to this acceleration of introducing BEV as evidenced from our May of 21 Capital Markets Day declarations and commitments. Our product plans transition to at least 40% BEV by the end of this decade in North America. And this is a very large vehicle product lineup, meaning trucks, SUVs, and commercial vehicles. These are the core of our business, and they're uniquely challenging from a performance standpoint. Bill Ford has been at the forefront of this transition and fully supports the Paris Accord commitments, leading by example on executing with large vehicles. Per our Capital Markets Day sharing, this transition requires us to make a very major investment while achieving cost efficiency to allow batteries that enable a sustainable and profitable transition to ICE. We're investing in the value chain, starting at the tier 1 cell levels, as announced by our partnerships with Korean supplier SK Innovation, who is supporting us currently through their Atlanta facility with the new F-150 Lightning, which is launching now through next spring. Long term, we need to have the optionality to build our own cells, like we do our own engines and transmissions today with the internal combustion engines. So with that, I want to touch on a couple slides here just to provide some basics on the value stream. So Abby, if I could jump to the slide with the flow, there we go. So as you can see, the basics around the cell are shown here. And what we are highlighting is the flow of extraction of the minerals. So you can see the range of minerals that we rely on within our battery cells, from a lithium, cobalt, nickel. You can see there in the extraction, about 50 to 70 billion is required just at the mining level in order to enable us to have the adequate supply. You can see the number of producers and the number of projects that are in the pipeline. After extraction, we go to chemical processing and refining. You see the producers and the projects there at nickel. Same with lithium, about 15 billion required. And this is largely for projects here through the decade. Once those minerals are processed, you're then into cathode and anode production. You see the number of producers and the number of new projects in the range of 40 billion. Then we're into cell manufacturing, and this is, as I referenced, in terms of the SKI partnership that we have. So the tier 1 battery cell makers, you see the number of plants and the increase since 16. But the tier 1 cell providers, the number of projects there, about 130 billion planned. And then us, the OEMs, with the range of product plans that we have already announced, add us all up, we're in the $300 billion range. If I could go forward one more slide to a little more detail on the value stream. The chain itself, beginning again at the raw materials, you can see the range of materials that we rely on, and then the processing that's necessary in terms of converting those raw materials into usable product. A usable product refined and processed largely overseas, which I'll talk about in a second. I'll show you a slide with the footprint, feeds into, for the most part, the cathode. And the cathode is what is utilized by the tier 1 suppliers for battery manufacture. That cathode is then at the tier 1 level and then feeds us and a range of applications, either EV or consumer electronics, or, as Nina mentioned, the energy storage. If I could go forward one more slide, from a value chain standpoint, you can see, let me start with the red items on this slide. Those are the tier 1 cell makers. And those cell makers, for the large part, have expanded globally. And then you can see the raw materials for the variety of materials we rely on, but the cathode itself, the processing itself, though, is very Asia-based, and when I mean Asia, largely China. So it's very concentrated, very China, especially the processing. The challenge with this is in terms of how best to localize and execute that. But I want to highlight one item, which is in terms of while the mining is difficult itself, that cathode production will start onshore eventually. But behind that will come the processing, and that really is the challenge that we face. The next slide, though, shows, and I'm just using nickel as an example, and this audience knows maybe more than we do here in terms of the availability of these materials, but over 80% of the nickel reserves are in areas that are ESG distressed. Yes, we have the access for nickel in Canada, but it's the primary material for us on these cells, and it has, I think, as we look forward to the decade, it is our largest challenge. But even though Canada might be available for us, we still have the challenge of accessing that. We do have, I think in the US, we will have the opportunity around the lithium. It's similarly important as the nickel. It has broader available footprint. However, from an immediacy of availability standpoint, we're still in the mid-decade. So the availability of the materials, very significant. The challenge, though, again, for us, as we see it, is around the processing. So, Abby, if we could go to that final slide with the footprint again. So in conclusion, we are individually making very substantial investments to participate in the battery value chain, starting with the cell manufacturer, and then we work upstream further. Per our May announcements, we're starting to pilot production facilities so we can manufacture our own cells at small scale to fully understand the entire chain. But again, the area that's most foreign to us will remain the mining and refining elements of the value chain. We're trying to learn and shape it via largely our own investment, such that we're able to fully trace and audit our materials from the mines through recycling back into the vehicles. Localization is key to enabling that efficient and sustainable business model. such that a majority of the consumers embrace the EV products and infrastructure versus being a push from the OEMs. We recognize here for this is not a sprint, but relationships and investments are moving quickly to protect our product plans. And the sooner that North America and the US can incentivize the upstream elements of the value chain to localize, this means close to 60% of the value of our batteries, the quicker the US can de-risk our supply chain during the transition. So I will end there. I look forward to any questions at the end. And with that, I will send it over to Carl.
We are strong partners with Ford from the point of view of supplying Ford with our electrical vehicle chargers. And with the Department of Defense, I know we're recently answering a request for information on how we measure our carbon footprint in our supply chain. So it's great to be on a panel with representatives from those organizations. So I would like to go to my slides here. Greg, do you have those up? Okay, let's see if it works here. Okay, let me go back one. So I want to start out by creating a context for the listeners about Siemens and our strategic commitment in the area of sustainability. So I want to talk to you about our initiative, which is called the Degree Framework. And it's built on already us having a strong background in sustainability among the industrial conglomerate kind of companies. We also see this as an area where we actually counsel customers on how to achieve their sustainability goals, because we're largely in the infrastructure business. And in the Degree Framework, which I'll share with you in a little more detail, we've established concrete goals for us for the future. And when I talk about nearshoring and offshoring, et cetera, of either mineral production or any kind of production, I have to speak about it within this particular context. So with that, let me just share with you a little bit about what the Degree program addresses. So at its heart, and one of the most important aspects is decarbonization. So we have a full court press now on working toward the science-based technology initiative with regard to reducing carbon emissions and keeping our planet warming metric to 1.5 degrees or less. So that's at the forefront. Second banner of the program, it has to do with our ethics focus. So on the ethics side, we're focused internally on our business conduct, but also in the area of cybersecurity and data protection. It does interface with our external partners as well. And then governance is all about the ESG side of the equation, making sure we're taking care of the environment, addressing social concerns and general governance. Resource efficiency, again, that is also about the way we handle factors of production with regard to materials and also product design in a way that is eco-friendly. And then equity and employability are two aspects that really are internally focused on our own staffing with regard to the opportunity for all genders to reach management potential and also all races basically having equal opportunity within the company, as well as employability relating to the training we give our employees on going forward and making sure they can stay as a major part of our workforce into the future. So on my next slide, I just want to point out a couple of things. We've made firm commitments into each of these areas, and on the decarbonization front, which does relate to nearshoring and onshoring a bit, we've got a commitment to be net zero on our operations by 2030. And then with regard to our supply chain, we're trying to be net zero by 2050. And we've committed to at least a 20% emission reduction in our supply chain by 2030. So we put the line in the sand and we're working very hard toward those objectives. The other one I'll point out in here is the resource efficiency. Again, it's all about eco-friendly design of our products. Secondly, what's germane to this discussion is we're talking about decoupling the raw materials from the end products that we buy. So that is very strongly related to what we're talking about today. And then the last one is circularity, which really means when a product reaches end of life, is there a way to reintroduce the materials in that product back into the supply chain so we reduce significantly what's going into waste? So that, in a nutshell, is our degree program. So with that, what I'd like to do next is just transition into what I'm calling the economic value equation. So when you ask us about what our thoughts are about onshoring and nearshoring and so on, we look at this as a multivariable equation, and it's very, very complex. And I'm going to walk you through some of the thinking behind this. So the first aspect is, as a sourcing professional, we would look at the standard things that we address, which is, first of all, the landed cost alternatives of bringing something from a market far away, with including the transportation and duties, et cetera, that's involved, versus what that would look like if we had access to domestic production, where, of course, maybe the FOB cost from a plant is much higher, but the transportation is much lower and the duties are avoided. So that's a standard thing we look at. And then the sourcing risk. So when we're looking at minerals and things of that nature, not all metal production is equal, and the quality of these things can differ significantly. So that's something we have to take into consideration when we look at sourcing variables, as well as reliability. What parts of the world are very difficult to move product out of and to support. So those are sourcing risks we consider. And then we also look, being a global company, we look at our production network, and we're trying to understand, where are these raw materials and component products, where are they going into to support our factories? Because we produce globally, and we do that for a reason, so that we can match pricing properly to the various markets. And we have to be conscious of the market price for a given product area, because we can't have factors of production that just make us totally non-competitive in certain markets. So that's part of the equation as well. And then lastly, technology changes. So when we talk about, in particular, battery storage and so on, the question is, there are a lot of R&D organizations working on alternative approaches to that space. And right now, the space may be dominated by products that have a lot of lithium involved in them, but will something else eventuate in the future that changes that picture? So those are all things we have to consider. And then on the degree side, our sustainability program side, we've got a bunch of other variables. So first of all, our carbon reduction goals, and what does it look like when we save on carbon emission from transporting something from China, but yet we're buying from a plant in the United States that also might be emitting carbon emissions? What's the trade-off there? Is that a net reduction for us, or are we actually being counterproductive? So we have to look at that. And then we've got the production environmental impact. We know in certain cases, refining minerals and the mining activities maybe require a lot of water in some cases. And then I had been in the oil industry for a good number of years, so I know when I visited the tar sands oil production up in Canada, the problem they have with the fines that come from the production. What do they do with all that material when they're finished refining? So there can be various environmental impacts that you have to consider in the equation as well. And then the issue on production circularity, is there potential when we design plants and so on in the US or in North America? Do we have an ability to introduce circularity to a greater extent? The cybersecurity risk, again, when you nearshore or onshore, that risk, I believe, is significantly different when you have to introduce data management and cybersecurity to foreign operations and tracking where things are in the supply chain. So the risk goes up the further away your supply chain exists. And then we have code of conduct requirements of our suppliers, and you can imagine it's much more expensive to verify that a company in Vietnam is complying with our standards on labor and other areas than if the company is domestic. So that's a factor we have to consider. And then lastly, the community social impact. So if we bring back production into the United States, whether it's mining or it's processing or it's completion of an end product like a battery, are we creating employment for our communities, or are there other impacts that offset that to a certain extent? So my ultimate message to everybody today is, for our company, this analysis of what we're doing with regard to nearshoring and onshoring, you know, for us, it's a work in progress still in terms of trying to figure out this particular equation. And then the other thing I would just like to emphasize is, we're talking about mineral and mining production maybe in the United States, but as some of the other speakers pointed out, we don't see precious metals as being that much of a bottleneck for us. We think our risk is sufficiently spread, so we're not that worried about it. The rare earths is another story, but if you look at lithium, again, as an example, you can get lithium in a lot of other places, as the other speakers spoke to. Our problem in the supply chain is that the production of the battery product itself is largely coming from China. So when we talk about nearshoring and offshoring, we have to also identify where that major risk is at. Is it at the raw material stage, or is it really at a final finished goods production stage? So with that, I would just like to conclude and be open for any questions as well.
Hello, I'm Murray Hitzman, and I'm hoping we can do this. So I'm going to talk to you primarily about the upstream side, looking at the very beginning of the supply chain, where the materials come from. And one thing that's been obvious to many, I'm sure, on this call, is that the US is very highly dependent on outside sources for a large number of its metal resources. This is data from the 2021 USGS Mineral Commodity Summary, which shows that a number of elements are imported at greater than 50% into the United States. And it's also interesting where these elements, where these minerals are coming from. And USGS has also shown this, again, from the Mineral Commodity Summary. And what we can see is that the dominant countries where importation is coming from include China, which is one of the largest of the places we get these metals and elements from, Canada, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and India. And so I've highlighted in red too that may be problematic for political reasons, but that's one way to look. I'm currently based in Ireland in the EU, and even though I'm American, I also have EU citizenship, and I'm now working on this issue over here. The EU has the same problem. It's very highly dependent also on outside sources for almost all its metal resources. There are differences. For instance, the EU is much more, has much greater nickel production than the United States does. So if we look at the list, there are some minor differences. However, when we look at where the EU gets its metals from, we see the two same countries in red, China being number 1, Russia being number 3. The United States, ironically, is the second biggest producer of metals for the EU. But after that, then some of the same countries. So similar problems. So what about the possibility of actually getting these minerals both from the US or its close allies? Well, this is a map from the US Geological Survey showing the location of historic mines across the country. And what you can really see is there's red dots everywhere. So these are for many, many commodities. But I think it gives the idea that, in fact, mineral deposits and mineral commodities aren't necessarily totally rare in the United States. It's simply that in many cases, we haven't been looking for them. And there's been many areas in the country where mineral exploration really hasn't taken place for a very long time, such as the Midwest. And that's one reason that the USGS, through its Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, or Earth MRI, is actually working to start to look and gather the data that will help us evaluate whether such mineral resources exist. Now, there's a lot colored in here, but the actual MRI, Earth MRI areas are the ones in blue, where geophysical work is being done, and those in this sort of grayish purple, which is where geochemical work is being done. The pink is geological mapping taking place primarily with state geological surveys. So as you can see, even with a program like this, large parts of the United States are not being covered, and we in fact do not have the geological, geochemical, and geophysical data to make accurate assessments of what the country may actually hold. The Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act that's passed the Senate does have significant funds to use with USGS to actually increase this work and help us understand better what's in the country. But in my humble opinion, not even vaguely enough to start to really do what we need to understand in the sort of timeframes we need if we're really going to be competitive and be able to tell companies like Ford and Siemens and our Defense Department whether we have the resources required. Europe's in a similar position. This is a map of historic mines in Europe. And again, same sort of issue. You can see it's completely full. There clearly has been historic mining of many of the commodities that people want through the continent of Europe. But Europe right now, with some exceptions like Ireland, parts of Scandinavia, and Spain, is not a major mining destination. However, mining does take place in the EU. Here in Ireland, you can see the biggest zinc mine in the continent sits basically adjacent and almost under a major town. And another mine here in Southern Ireland, which just finished production, is now an agricultural, biological, and essentially environmental research center. So retooling a mine site for something else. The EU is responding to the critical minerals crisis with significant funding for both primary raw materials and secondary materials research by academia and industry groups. And as I'll point out in a minute, that's something the United States is not yet doing. So in terms of public investment in primary mineral resources research, I've listed sort of 3 groups and 5 different countries or country groups in terms of the EU. So in terms of National Geological Survey work, such as that by Earth MRI, by the USGS, National Geological Surveys are being funded in the United States, and to a large degree, multiple national surveys in the EU. Canada is putting in significant resources, and Australia is putting in very, very significant resources into this national group. China, it's hard to know, but from what I understand and talking with folks there, it will be more comparable to China. In terms of public investment in primary mineral resource research with industry, the US is doing virtually nothing. The EU has significant programs, as does Canada, as does Australia, and of course, the blurriness between industry and government in China makes this very hard to understand. In terms of public investment going to academia, so academic research on primary mineral resource research, there is virtually 0 in the United States, relatively significant here in the European Union and in Canada, very significant in Australia, and very significant in China as well. So with that, what I'd say is to meet the challenges of ensuring a reliable and secure supply chain for critical minerals, both the US and the EU, as well as Canada and Australia, need to invest more now in research to identify new primary sources of critical minerals, as well as develop more means of recovering such materials from secondary sources. Because as was pointed out by some of the previous speakers, this is going to take multiple ways of doing this to ensure our supply chains are secure. New primary raw materials are needed, and it is certainly true that we need to actually look at secondary sources and ensure a more circular economy and more recycling. Thank you very much. I'll be happy for questions after in the discussion.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone who has so far put questions in the chat. If you haven't posted a question in the chat yet, please do so now. I would like to invite all of our speakers back onto the screen with me now to engage in a panel and question and answer discussion to delve a little bit deeper into a lot of the subjects that we have heard about in their remarks thus far. I'm going to start out with a question broadly to all of the speakers, and perhaps you can address them in the order in which you began speaking. So Nina, maybe you first. Can you speak a little bit more clearly and maybe really hit it home for us on why it is so important that the United States and our allies are also able to provide a lot of these aspects of the mineral supply chain for your sector? You mentioned that, we're getting a lot of things from China, from other countries. What does it mean for defense in particular that we are not able to source some of these things from ourselves and our allies?
So the term that I hear a lot in our dialogue is, in terms of national security, it's resiliency. If there is a conflict, if there is a conflict going forward and they cut off our supply, what happens to our ability to store energy, to make batteries, to continue to evolve, whatever all these other speakers have said, continue to evolve us into electrification of the battlefield, electrification of installations. And I think that's the concern. I mean, if we anticipate a conflict, what happens? And it reduces our ability to be resilient.
Next up, Robert, would you be able to address the same question?
I think from an immediate standpoint, we are migrating, as I shared, at I'll say the tier 1 cell manufacturer localization. We're taking steps there. The next level is the cathode, but longer term, we are so reliant on the nickel and the lithium that as we grow our footprint, and we're, again, 40% of our product base is wanting to be EV and BEV. And it's really about the cost efficiency, but the supply de-risking. Frankly, we're living this today on the microchip standpoint. Our days are consumed with, we can't get enough supply out of Asia on the chips. And it's a great current example of what not having local supply means. We are now, on the automotive side, we are now subservient to the consumer electronics industry and who's paying the highest margin, and they decide the allocation as to who's getting what on the chips. And we really have little control over the 5 or 6 primary providers, all Asian-based. And every day is spent trying to convince those areas to prioritize auto, prioritize Ford. And the raw material discussion is not much different from that. I think if we fast forward a bit and we truly migrate to 40 to 50% BEV, the last thing I want to be doing is trying to negotiate with, just generically, the Asian nations to provide me with supply. I need to get it here such that we can ensure that our 50 to 60,000 UAW jobs that we're satisfying today out of the US are protected.
Robert. Carl, what about from the clean energy perspective?
About de-risking the supply chain, for us, it's similar. It's a little bit more in the nature of rebalancing the supply chain, because in standard procurement practice and sourcing practice, you've got to establish multiple sources of supply for those items that are critical for you. So that's very relevant for us as well.
Thank you. And finally, Murray, do you have anything that you'd like to add just from hearing all of these downstream sectors who are talking about, what it means to them to reshore and nearshore these things from an upstream perspective? What does that make you think of, and how can we make sure that the supply here can meet the demand?
Yeah, there's several things that I'd like to comment on. One, I think, as I said before, I think most of the materials are available either in the US or the other three countries I mentioned who are allies, the EU, Canada, and Australia. However, finding the resources takes many years. And once we actually have found something that is potentially economic as a resource, these days it takes between 10 and 20 years to put it into production. So we're looking at a time gap now that may be 30 years from today when we actually have a real new source of, let's say, cobalt in the United States. That's a long time. 30 years is these days is forever.
I'll be retired by then.
So I do worry that this is that's why I put now in bold in my last slide. Now is the time, if we're concerned about this, to act.
Thank you very much, Murray. I'm going to go to a question from the audience now. This is for Rob from Ford. As the most critical metal for Ford's electrification transition, does Ford plan to address nickel in its responsible mineral sourcing standards? Will carbon and human impacts become more of a focus for not only Tier 1 cell suppliers, but also for Tier 2, cathode, and Tier 3 metal suppliers, which often have more significant ESG issues?
Absolutely, and it is a foundation of our sourcing activities on the ESG and the traceability in terms of where these materials are coming from. And this is a primary driver as to why we are walking down the path of being able to make cells ourselves and be able to invest in lithium mines or nickel providers, such that, it's relatively early days. The acceleration that has happened in the EV side is astounding. However, we've heard from a historical standpoint, we know we need to have that traceability down to the individual mines, and we do that as part of our sourcing and even co-sourcing raw materials. That is fundamental to what we're doing in terms of not only our current launches, but as we're sourcing 23, 24, 25 calendar year and beyond, it's foundational to our terms in order to be very clear as to where these materials are coming from.
Robert, and maybe just an add-on to that question, you mentioned traceability and tracking. That is something that we at SAFE here are very interested in examining as a way to make sure that our mineral supply chains are secure and are, adhering to high standards that help to benefit American and allied workers. Maybe you and maybe some other of the downstream speakers on the panel, Nina, maybe Carl, how are you guys tracking and able to trace your supply chains right now? Are you looking into different frameworks such as blockchain technology to make sure that, as things move through the supply, you are able to see whether they are meeting the standards that you hope they are meeting?
I think from a DoD perspective, that's something that's a hot topic right now. And I don't know that we have the solution for it, but it's something that we're trying to do, and I would love to learn from the commercial sector of what they're doing.
Excellent. Carl, I don't know if you maybe have anything to add. Maybe Siemens degree framework has a tracking aspect to it.
Again, what we're doing is it's part of the de-risking of the supply chain as well, and also supply chain resiliency, taking our end products, breaking them down into the BOMs, the bills of materials, and then mapping those bills of materials around the world to where they're coming from, and then working with those first tier suppliers to map their supply chains. And trying to tie all that data together is a major challenge, but it's going to be necessary because as a for-profit company, the minute you have a blip, whether it's a weather-based blip or political unrest blip, you have to know what that's going to do to your revenue and profitability picture, and who you can substitute quickly and how much that's going to cost you. So
Exactly.
we have to have all that in place.
So I think Abby, you're like hitting on a really important question that we need to get our heads around. And I don't know that DoD has the answer, but it's certainly top priority for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll shift gears to another question from the audience. Maybe this one is more for Murray. What environmental precautions need to be taken in the mining sector in order to ensure that the mining for these minerals does not adversely affect the benefits we would get out of the use of these minerals in the creation of batteries for electric vehicles?
So excellent question, and one that people are worried about all around the world. Most of the major mining companies that I am familiar with and work with, this is now part of the feasibility study they do before they actually proceed to mining at all. So before, we actually just looked at mineability, grade, how we were going to mine it. Now that question is front and center. How is it going to impact society? How is it going to impact environment? And those things are stop signs just as much as in the old days it used to be grade and tonnage. So no, that's exactly it. And because we have those mines have to sell product to the Fords and the Siemens, and they are going to look at where things are from. And if the mine initially has a problem, they will not be able to sell their product.
So Murray, I have a question for you, just to counter talk. Are you okay with that, Abby?
Yes, absolutely, please.
Okay. So because what I understand, and I'm not a mining expert, but what I understand is the risk, the environmental risk, isn't the mining, it's the processing. Can you speak to that, Murray?
It depends on which commodity it is. So for most conventional base metals, so that would include nickel, copper, processing is an issue with smelting, but we have technologies that we know how to deal with it. Some of the rare earth processing becomes very interesting and is problematic. And that needs more research, and that research is being done in the United States and in Europe. But I don't think we have all the answers yet. So that's something that needs to be done. That is an area, that needs to be followed up.
And so my understanding, Murray, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that is the rare earths. It's the processing of the rare earths that create byproducts that our regulatory system doesn't know how to handle. But I think that we have Department of Energy labs that know how to handle byproducts. Idaho, Nevada, Oak Ridge in Tennessee. These are government resources that know how to handle this. But what we haven't done is put that processing into their labs and say, how can we do this?
I think there are some projects where there actually is more synergies than you may think. Colorado School of Mines comes to mind. They're actually doing in Ames, Iowa as well, Iowa State.
Yes, in Ames, yeah.
Right. So some rare earth resources are challenged by both uranium and thorium, and the famous Mountain Pass in California is one.
Yes. Yes.
But many other rare earth resources do not have that challenge. So again, it depends on the individual deposit. And other deposits have other challenges. Some deposits have high arsenic, for instance, which is not environmentally what we normally would like either, which we can control, but this has a higher cost. So this is where
kind of, I think, regulatory and policy and ambition.
Right, and economics. So all three come together, right? We need the right regulation to point us in the right way of what we need to do for society. We need the right economics to be able to have it so private industry can actually make some money. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. Right. And both these need government to weigh in the right way to make it happen.
Thank you for that crosstalk, and thank you so much, Murray. We have a couple more questions from our audience that I'd love to fit in just in our few remaining minutes, but that was wonderful. Thank you. This question is maybe for, well, it's for all of you, and maybe we'll start with Nina. It has to do with our allies. So looking at the integrated defense industrial bases of both Canada and the United States, and the fact that they use Quebec's aluminum, to name one mineral, and the key role that that has played in North America's arsenal for democracy since at least World War II, how can we be leveraging our relationship with allies like Canada or with our friends in Europe, Murray, as you mentioned, to be meeting these needs? And actually, yeah.
Oh, gosh. So that becomes very political, and I'm not really allowed to speak on behalf of DoD. But I can say that we think about that every day in our role in Defense Innovation Unit. We think about, you know, how do we use allies? And I mean, you guys will know this more, the rest of the panel. You know, I've heard talks, and I've talked to Abby about this, of, you know, well, we have this great ally, you know, in Australia, but when you dig down, they're 40% owned by China. So, you know, how do you do that? I don't know that I can speak to that. And I would be, I would be beyond my ability to say that, except that the world without allies would be a dismal world.
Thank you, Nina. Robert?
I think we have, the way we try to manage our supply chain, and we are in an interesting time. We're very USMCA focused based on the obligations that we have in our North American operations, and we balance between Canada, Mexico, and the US, and manage with our UAW partners. I think we have evolved as we look forward to this raw materials topic. We're treating it as a North American topic, to where how do we compete efficiently, but also don't say put ourselves at risk here in the US. So we're sensitive to what we can and can't get done in North America. I'd say Europe has taken a different approach, and a continental approach to how to manage. So we're comfortable there. The wild card clearly is China. We have operations there. We try to compete, but the sands are shifting, and I think we're very much in a wait and see mode. You've seen from our own investment, that for us, it's North America and Europe. We're comfortable operating there, and we're trying to localize and manage them.
Thank you, Robert. We are coming up to the end of our event here. So I know we have a couple other questions in the chat that we were not yet able to address, but we'll see if we can get some answers from our speakers and send those out to the attendees. But I just want to thank all of our speakers again for joining us here today and addressing some of these issues about our critical mineral supply chains, and how we can ensure, as we transition to this increasingly electric connected future, that we have the materials that we need to achieve these goals, to make sure that the US and our allies can remain competitive and are not left behind in this race for the future. So thank you again for participating. Thank you again to all of our speakers, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.